Well, again, good morning.
Morning.
We are now week 5, and week 5, our theme is letting go of shoulds. Letting go of shoulds. We all have those, don't we? Yeah. So, God. Good morning. We haven't started yet. We're just getting going. So, we'll start in a moment with our opening prayer, and then we'll have our quiet time, which will also allow if there's any more people that might be coming. I'll just wait for a moment. All right. The opening prayer this week comes from something called Guerrillas of Grace, and it's written by Ted Loder. Loder?
Challenger.
So, let us pray. Help me to believe in beginnings, to make a beginning, to be a beginning, so that I may not just grow old, but grow new each day of this wild, amazing life you call me to live with the passion of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. So let's just, as we have before, take a few minutes. You all know how to do it. Just relax, be comfortable, close your eyes, and do a 4 or 5 slow, deep breaths in. Hold your breath, and then slowly breathe out. So breathing in love and light and healing, and letting go. Letting go of everything as you breathe out. Take a minute just to gradually open your eyes, take a few breaths again, then we'll gather for a talk. Okay. Well, how did the rest of last week's discussion go for you, your daily reflections? Maybe it may help, look back at your booklet. We meet on Tuesdays, so there's Wednesday and Thursday, Friday, Saturday before the new theme starts again. Is there something from either our discussion last week or in the days following that you'd like to share? Is there some image, some comments, some points from some of the contributors to the daily reflections that you'd like to share? And just feel free, put your hand. Okay? Pass this to you, Bob.
I was surprised to find out that something that I didn't think was bothering me was really bothering me because of not letting it go. And it just came up in all of these exercises that we're doing. It just came up again and again. So I need to do something about it.
Thank you. Thank you for the honesty in sharing that. Anyone else have a similar, Eva?
Last week we dealt a little bit with the reading for that day, which was Love is a Decision. And beneath the title is this description from 1 Corinthians 13 about what love is. And what I took away from that is that it is behaviors, it's not just a feeling. The tendency is, when we talk about love, there's a feeling you have towards other people, or what you see in nature, a feeling of love. But this is a decision, and it's acting. And that just came to me, wow, it's not as difficult as we might think that it is, because it's how you relate with other people. It's not just a feeling that imagine you have warm feelings towards other people that you meet in your life. And then what came to me is when Jesus was talking to his disciples, and I do not know where in the gospel he said this, but the church choir will be singing this on Monday, Thursday. I give you a new commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. And 1 Corinthians 13 tells you how to love. And it just made it a lot simpler for me, and it was kind of like an aha moment for me.
Thank you. And that comes from the reading on Monday, Thursday, from John chapter 13.
Oh, it's John. Okay.
And mandate, or mandi, is from commandment. So the new commandment, to love one another. Thank you.
I'll get the microphone. Thanks, Pete. I grew up in a home that didn't allow feelings. They were all bad. And certainly anger was one of them. And after I left home and found out how to appropriately accept anger and vent it, I discovered that anger is not all bad. There's such a thing as righteous anger. And this could be confusing, but if you remember, Jesus got very angry with the Pharisees and the high priests and called them names. I mean, some awful names like, you whited sepulchre, you brood of vipers and all that. But when he was doing that, I believe that he also loved them and that he was disappointed that they were carrying on that way. And they were just coming out of their egos, and they were just rule keepers, and they didn't know how to love, practice love themselves. And so there's a huge difference between righteous anger out of love and anger that blocks love, as you got on the board there. And that's very different. And anger that blocks love comes from fear. Fear is the basic emotion. And when I'm doing that breathing exercise, I breathe in love and breathe out fear, because that's really the bottom line of the whole thing. So, thanks. Here, June.
I'm trying to get my foot out of it. All right, well, the April 2nd, this is making it personal at the bottom, you have on the board, think of the time when you walk by faith and not by sight. And it talks about, did you see God's presence at that time? It reminded me of a story, it brought up a story from my childhood that I couldn't get out of my mind the rest of the week, so we might as well. When I was a kid, my family would take a day trip to the Jersey Shore every now and then. And when I was 14, we went to Atlantic City, and my thing was swimming in the ocean, and I liked to body surf the waves. And this particular day, and I was good at it, this particular day the ocean was too rough to do that, so I was just floating in the shallows when I heard my brother David, who was 7 years old at the time, call me, and I saw him way out much deeper than I dared to go. So I immediately swam out and grabbed him and tried to swim in with him, but I couldn't do it. I didn't know it then, but we were caught in a riptide. And the more I tried, the further out we were pulled. So I said, I knew, let's grab the next wave and let that dude push us in. When I turned around to look for the wave, there was none. It was smooth out to the horizon line. We had been pulled out beyond the breakers. The breakers were so high, I could hardly see the shoreline. There was no one but us, no boats, no people, nothing. So I said to David, start saying your prayers, we're going to die. And I recited the Lord's Prayer out loud so he would know I wasn't playing around. And then I turned to my own prayers. I recited the general confession and every other prayer I could think of. And interestingly enough, this calmness came over me. I was not nervous or upset, or I didn't fight this I felt like a dome of calmness came over me. And when I finished with my prayers and my mini life review, I didn't have much life to review at 14, I said to God, I'm ready to join you now. If you want me in heaven, that's fine with me. I'm ready. And then almost as a afterthought, I said, you know, God, I'd really rather live. But only if you have a task for me, a job for me on this earth, a reason for my living. And if that's the case, then you've got to get me out of this, because there's nothing I can do for myself. I am completely in your hands. And I was ready to let myself slip under at that very instant. And I said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And as the word spirit left my mouth, there was a plop in the water. And I opened my eyes and looked up, and the lifeboat was in front of us. And we were saved. When I got back onto dry sand, all I could think of was, God really must have big plans for me to have created such a dramatic rescue.
Wow.
And I thought, I'm going to do something really big in this life, like find a cure for cancer or whatever. Well, that didn't happen. I lived a very mundane, ordinary life. And it took me till midlife, really, to understand that it doesn't have to be one big thing. It can be day-to-day kindnesses towards others. And I know God was with me at that time, because I didn't fight or struggle, and if I would have done that, we would have drowned. I was just completely calm. And at that point in my life, other times in my life, I haven't been so faithful, but at that point in my life, I had complete faith and trust that God would take care of me one way or the other.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. And there's no such thing as a mundane life, because you never know. You never know how something you have done or said made a difference in someone else's life.
I've learned that.
And that might be one purpose, even if we don't know. But that's an amazing story. Thank you. Thank you. Becky.
I was just going to say that on letting go, when you're so angry or so hurt, what I have found is that the more you tell your story, the less power it has over you, and tell the story just as another story. And that's one way that I have found to get over really rough spots.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Tagging on to what Becky just said, this past Sunday, I was up in Casa Grande, and there's a couple who are pretty good friends of mine when I was a vicar there. And there was just a woman in church, and she said her husband now has Alzheimer's and a bunch of other health issues. And I asked, she said, would you like to come over for dinner today? And I said, yeah, I could do that. And I asked if she thought her husband might like communion. So she gave him a call, and he apparently indicated yes, he would. So I went there, and immediately after church, in the receiving line, she was one of the last to come through, and she started telling me the story about problems that she's having with her kids, and they don't want to talk to her anymore, and all that sort of stuff. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a wonderful dinner. But anyway, I went, and we sat for a while before we had dinner, and she and her husband chimed in, retelling this whole story about how their relationships with their kids were so terrible. And I'm thinking to myself, well, who's at greater fault here? And again, all of the readings that we've been, this particular, the one on anger and holding on to it, really popped into my head. And I just thought there are so many of us that we need to tell people our stories and help to get over them. And hopefully, one of the people that we might tell will have some good advice to get beyond the anger and to look inside and see where that anger is coming from. And if we're not part of the problem and not just part of the solution.
Thank you. Well, that's a great sort of segue into talking about this, and I know Tom already touched on it a few moments ago. Letting go of anger that blocks love and prevents healing and reconciliation. Let's break into groups just for 5-6 minutes and talk about that a little bit more. How does that get in the way, and have you experienced that either as the one doing it or the one on the receiving end of it? How has that gotten in the way, perhaps, of relationships and potential healing and reconciliation? And have you successfully worked through, or someone else who is angry or whatever the issue is? Can you share maybe? Is there a good positive story of how this still worked out and there was some reconciliation? Okay. So maybe again 5-6 minutes or so, just to maybe at your table groups, and then let's just share for a few minutes before we move on to this week. If anyone does want to speak, we do have the microphone. Remember, we make sure the video pick up everyone's voices.
It's kind of sad. Like how our grandma was the glue. When grandma died, everything fell apart. Started falling apart. Then my mom was sort of the glue.
Okay.
And my brother and I.
Thank you. Obviously, this was a good discussion piece. So, I heard, at least in the group that I was sitting with, there are ways to work through some of the angers and the blocks between us and others. The other part that some of you may perhaps also be dealing with is anger towards God, perhaps. So when we're having to look at issues of anger, it could be anger at God, it could be anger at other people, it could be anger with ourselves.
Anger at the church.
Anger at the church. Yeah, there's a little bit of that goes around. So how do you deal with that? How do you work through some of that to come to a point of healing and reconciliation, whether it's church, God, self, others? Something's quiet. But I was hearing some really good thoughts. Okay, Tom, we'll have to do the microphone again, just for the video's sake.
Well, I had shared about being in a home that the feelings weren't okay, and I had to get some help. I had to go to a place where I could express my resentment. And I hadn't done that before. And when I got into the resentments thing, I found that very helpful because I just had blocked all that stuff. And then, so I said, this is what I resent about my mother. This is what I resent about my dad. This is what I resent about my first wife, and all this kind of thing. And it was very helpful because it was garbage. It was stuff that had sat in me for so long. And it's kind of like bad food, you know? And so when I vetted that stuff, and this is in a place where they kind of like AA, the 12 steps, and the first thing you start with your resentments, and then you go on to the steps themselves, and I did 4 of them, but that was my way of letting go to a lot of stuff that had just been stored up over the years.
Thank you. And someone else had mentioned earlier about naming it. You got to name it.
Yep.
And it loses the hold on you and allows you to begin the process of healing.
Just what Tom said, it reminds me.
Here, I'll give you the mic.
What Tom said about the garbage, maybe we should just have a banner in our bathroom mirror or something saying, remember to take out the garbage once a week.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Thank you. Other thoughts of how did you deal with it? And I know everyone at some point has dealt with that. What has helped you in the past, or maybe present, to deal with addressing that feeling within yourselves? Because we do have to get rid of the garbage, take that garbage out, because it does affect us spiritually, emotionally, physically. We talked about that in a previous session. So what are the ways, if you had to name 2 or 3 positive approaches to it, of letting go of something, what do you do? How do you, prayer, okay?
I think like Tom said, processing it has helped me in acceptance of, because I found that I was always wanting people to think the way I thought. And when I came to the realization that that's who they were, I reached that point of healing and reconciliation instead of struggling with it all the time. Well, why is she thinking like that? Why does she do that? And finally realizing that's who she is, and then I was able to let go.
Thank you. I did hear one person was saying about forgiveness. Forgiveness is along with prayer and letting go, is such an important part of breaking down the blocks between us and others, and God. Forgiving ourselves, whatever it is, forgiveness. You know, Jesus talks about that. Forgive us, our sins or our trespasses, as we forgive sins or trespasses that others do against us. And it has to start. We have to do it at some point if we're going to bring about that healing and reconciliation within ourselves or with other people. Charlotte?
I
grew up in a family with an alcoholic father, and there was a lot of anger. And as an adult, what I've learned is in any situation where I may feel anger or I may feel resentment or whatever, I have a choice. And I stop myself now and I think, what do I need to do here? And most often it's don't react. Be silent and work through it. And in my family, that just wasn't practiced. And I've also been an addiction therapist, and having gone through those things myself has helped me in some ways, and also in doing spiritual direction, is helping other people realize that there is always a choice in my mind. Am I going to make it, or am I going to react?
Yeah, I mentioned about resentments to my parents, but I want you to know that I love them to pieces. And one thing that helped me was to be able to know enough about them when they were young, before they ever got married, to see that they were real people, and you know, the beautiful things about them. And I found that very helpful to look at old pictures and hear relatives talking about them and stuff. And it reminded me of that movie Back to the Future, you know, where he went back and saw his mother before, when she was young, before she ever married and was his dad. I mean, mother. Who's next?
Behind.
Oh,
Nelson?
Nope.
No? Oh, you're just
Oh,
aiming
okay.
the
Oh, I
video.
thought I saw you.
Well, thank you. We do, just looking at the time, we need to continue moving on a bit, but thank you for all that sharing. We should go on to this week. And I'll leave this one with you here, and that's something that you could just consider in your own reflections. This came from Saturday, and this was about, can you recall a time when you walked by faith and not by sight? Walk by faith but not by sight. Walk by faith and not by sight. It's hard to walk by faith sometimes. And when we're dealing with certain situations in our life, we need to go in faith also, that God is with us in those difficult times, will help us address maybe obstacles and blocks in our life. So just something, again, to go back and maybe reflect on as you do the next few days. But this week, I want to get onto our theme, and it's about the letting go of shoulds and how we live our life. You know, we tend to live our lives a lot by how others we think expect us to live. And Galatians chapter 1, verse 10, Scott Stoner in the Monday reflection that was yesterday, touches on the verse, and I'll share the verse with you. And that's on page 53, if you like to just look at it. It's right at the top of the page. And it's coming off, of course, the gospel reading that we had on Sunday of Mary, you know, and the expensive perfume that she put on Jesus to anoint him. So Galatians chapter 1, verse 10. Am I now seeking human approval or God's approval? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still pleasing people, I would not be a servant of Christ. What do you think of that? Who are you? Who are you? Are you a person that tends to please people? And he does go on to say, if you read the reflection, it's okay to please others as an act of kindness. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? But he goes on to say, but in excess, there's always the extremes, right? But in excess, being a people pleaser and avoiding conflict just to make others happy is not good for us. Actually, that goes back to here. Because when we just try to do things to please other people, yet we're not being authentic in ourselves, we create anger within ourselves. We become angry at the other person, when really it's us that are dealing with the issues. So let's talk about that verse out of Galatians chapter 1. Whose approval are you seeking? Whose approval are you seeking? Are you seeking God's approval or people's approval? What kind of person are you? And some of that might depend on how we were raised. Better be good. Fall in line. Don't do anything to make people upset.
Right.
I mean, being the head of a family or being head of a church, we all want approval, right? But there are times you can't always please. I think there's songs about that. Can't please everyone. But who are we focusing on when we are trying to please? Is it other people's expectations of us? Or are we trying to please God? So what I'd like you to do now, for about maybe 10 minutes, break into your groups again, and let's talk about that in terms of pleasing people or God. And have you experienced that? Have you ever gotten into a situation where you feel you have been limited based on other people's expectations of you? You haven't been allowed to be free and be out there and do what you want because mom expected this, or dad expected this, or my boss expected that, or my parish expected this. Yeah, church is in there too. You've got to remember, church has expectations that don't always allow people to let their wings be free and be themselves. But that's not always a bad thing. We all need form. We all need structure. Episcopalians are great at structure.
Yeah.
So let's take about 10 minutes or so and let's just talk about that.
I told Esther I can't even believe it.
Would anyone like to share anything from their table discussions? Would you like to share something? And again, we all learn from each other. So there might be something that you can share that will benefit someone else who is here. What about that? People pleasing or God pleasing? And I'd like to read before we go into a little discussion. Page 52. Page 52, which is at the end of the reflection for this past Sunday. And again, the gospel story of Mary, right? And Judas complaining, why did you sell the perfume and money to the poor and all the shoulds? That's should. Hey, maybe we side with Judas on that. No, she should have sold it, shouldn't she? That's another question. But on page 52, I can feel constrained by what others might think, by unspoken norms and disapproving looks. But there is a wonderful freedom in Mary's letting go of others' opinions. Remember that Mary already disregarded convention to sit and learn at Jesus' feet like a male disciple, rather than take a woman's place in the kitchen with Martha. And here Mary once again shows that her love and devotion for Jesus compels her to let go and to let the Spirit enter into, respond with extravagant love. And it goes on to say, I invite you this week to notice the places you might be listening to the crowd rather than to the Spirit. Where can we let go to let in extravagant love? So Mary, all the things she should have done, She should have been with Martha in the kitchen. She should have listened. Right? She shouldn't have been sitting at the feet of Jesus as a male disciple, because that's a whole other cultural thing. The shoulds. But in the expectations, that first line at the top of the page, I can feel constrained by what others might think, by unspoken norms and disapproving looks. Who relates to that one sentence? Okay, hands are finally flying up. Who has the microphone?
I do.
Oh, right here.
Diane. And it's only, now, Diane, it's because it's for the video sound. Yeah.
Okay, in the month of March.
Turn the mic on.
Turn the mic on.
Hold it up.
Hold it up.
I think it's on.
Hello? Green light.
Or did you turn it on?
The green light's on.
Green light on?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
You have to hold it up to your mouth.
Okay, in the month of March, I had a really difficult month. I can't hear him.
Yeah, you're here.
Okay, I lost my sister, my brother, and my niece.
Oh, wow.
All in this last few weeks. And I've been asked to give my sister and my niece, it's her youngest daughter that died in emergency surgery. And Sally died because we're getting old. But still, she's my best friend. And she has been for 80 years. And she has 4 beautiful children, wonderful children. And one of them, has a different political feeling than I do. And so she has kind of turned away from us. But they are doing the memorial for my sister, who was a Lutheran. And my sister practiced her faith. She went to the church right across the street. And we moved down here because of her choice to move down after her husband died. And I've been asked to say a prayer at both that memorial, which is being held at a hotel, and my brother's memorial, which is being held in a church venue. And so I've been so concerned about what that prayer is going to be like and not be preachy to people that I really don't know how their faith works. And I'm going to be the oldest one there. Everybody else is, none of my sister's friends have been included in this, nor my niece, but it's going to be a very nice sit-down luncheon, and everybody's going to share good stories about both of them, and I'm going to be asked to say a prayer. And I have been thinking what I could say that would not sound like I'm preaching to them. And so today's class has given me a new insight that I'm going to not try to please them. I'm going to please God. And the message will be delivered the way that I should. Yes, that I want to deliver, let's say that. So that's my story.
Thank you, Diane.
Thanks, Diane.
I saw a bunch of hands go up as we started talking. Jenny, was that you, Jenny?
Yes, behind you.
And the comment was, I feel constrained by what others might think, by unspoken norms, disapproval norms.
Well, I was a Martha, and so I was always jealous of people that were Marys, because they shouldn't do that. That wasn't what's supposed to, you're supposed to be here, not, here. And then, again, through faith and speaking in events like this, I'm not jealous anymore. That's the way they are. It's between God and them. It has nothing to do with me. I am who I am. And if I'm inclined to be like a Mary, then that's not my nature. I have to be true to myself, and God will lead me, listen to what he's saying. So I'm not a Martha anymore, I hope. Let me know if I am.
Doesn't God
So-
use Marthas?
So in addition to this, it's about
But the jealousy.
true to ourselves also, right? So you can almost add that in there. We please others because we're getting the look.
Yeah.
Pleasing God and being true to ourselves. So,
I want to speak up in defense of Martha's. The story is very, kind of one-sided or too, however you want to put it in the Bible, I think, because Marthas can be multitaskers too. Marthas can listen.
Yes.
I think Sandy Eckstein is a great example of somebody that can do both of those things. And I don't know, anyway, if a person who's busy in the kitchen can find time to listen while they're working, perhaps. Maybe they weren't in the kitchen in the story, but, I think that's possible. Who's next?
thank you. Anyone else wanted to share? If not, okay, that's great. Thank you so much. And as we, in the same sort of direction from today, actually, from Tuesday, learning to live from the inside out. Learning to live from the inside out. It says it requires a radical shift in our thinking. And it's based on two essential skills. This is page 54. Okay? It means when we're living from the outside in, the expectations on us, it means we are overly focused on living up to expectations of others. And there are, of course, times we might, we want to do exactly that. But if our default, against that extreme again, if it's always to do what others want or expect, then it says we will most likely end up depleted and possibly resentful. So how do we live, and so we'll finish up today with the question, how do we live authentically, pleasing God and ourselves, and living from the inside out versus everything on us and just trying to please other people? So how do we live from the inside out? And we'll just leave that with you. So if you haven't read today's reflection yet, do that later on, or go back to it maybe if you read it quickly this morning in time for class. Read it again, and then go through the next few days. Next week we will not have the class because of Holy Week and having to be at the cathedral. So we'll finish up on the 19th of April, which again is not a bad thing because it allows you to go through the Holy Week reflections right up to Easter, and we'll come back and we'll talk. Now, there was one other thing Reverend Judy and I were talking about. I don't know if we'll have an opportunity on the last day or not, but she has something that some of you may have already done with her in the past. It's Stations of the Resurrection instead of Stations of the Cross. And it's about the encounters, the resurrection encounters of Jesus after Easter, or the rising on Easter. So it's something we could, I will talk with Reverend Judy, but I was thinking maybe we can do something like that. And even if we had to do it inside here, Reverend Judy, we could always do it in here where it's a little cooler, and maybe just We gotta put those up on the wall a little easier with that sticky stuff, perhaps. Anyway, something to consider. But please go through the next few days and through the Holy Week reflections, and we'll meet again on April 19th to finish up. Let's now, before we leave, we'll finish with a prayer. And this prayer today comes from the New Zealand Prayer Book. The New Zealand Prayer Book. So let us pray. God be your comfort, your strength. God be your hope and support. God be your light and your way. And the blessing of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Giver of life, remain with you now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.